The GV70 sitting up on a hill behind me is the electric GV70, one of 3 electrified Genesis products that's going to be launching in the 3rd quarter of this year. And today we've been given a brief preview drive and a glimpse into what to expect from the brand's electric future. So in today's video, we're going to be checking out the outside of the car and the small differences between it and the petrol variants, checking out the cabin, and then walking around to the boot to see what that's like, and finally taking it for a short drive. But first, let's talk through the key performance aspects and changes of this electrified GV70. The key specs of the electrified GV70. Now, this vehicle is going to be pitched at the top of the GV70 range. Genesis reckons it's going to cost about $105,000 to $115,000 when it launches here in Australia, though final pricing will be announced later on. It is based on the same platform as the regular GV70, so it is a combustion car made to be an electric vehicle, though it still uses the same 800-volt electric architecture found in eGMP products, including the forthcoming electrified GV60. That means that this car can take on ultra-rapid charging, up to 350 kilowatts, says Genesis, and in reality that means from 10 to 80% of charge for this vehicle, which is about 350 kilometers of range. You're going to be able to do that in 18 minutes, which is pretty rapid. Next, the power outputs, because this is also head and shoulders above the 3.5-litre turbo GV70 in terms of grunt, with 360 kilowatts available on boost mode and 700 newton meters from a pair of equally powered electric motors. Range is quoted at around 450 kilometers in the WLTP cycle, though exact figures will be disclosed closer to this vehicle's launch. The presentation of the GV70's cabin has always been really sharp. It's very different from anything else out there on the market, and I think Genesis is really starting to find their feet in terms of having their own design language inside the cabin. Now, this vehicle, the electrified GV70, only comes in one specification, so you don't get the basic, then the luxury, then the sport that you do in the standard range. Instead, this vehicle is effectively the same as a luxury variant. Now, this is a pre-production vehicle, so not everything is correct, but my initial touchies and feelies of this vehicle suggest that this is a really nicely made pre-production example. Most of the plastics feel very high quality. The only big thing in this vehicle is it doesn't have a representative gauge cluster. It's got a semi-digitized cluster. In the final production version, it will have the 12.3-inch digital driver's display with that cool 3D graphic, so it will be fully specified. The technology package continues to be strong with a 14.5-inch touchscreen. It is a fair reach to actually touch it from back here in the seat, but you do have a rotary controller down here which works really nicely and interfaces with Genesis's rather crisp presentation of the infotainment software. Below that, we've still got a semi-physical HVAC control system that isn't buried in the menus. That's great. Heated and ventilated seats with massage function now for both the driver and the passenger, which is slightly different to the luxury variant of the normal GV70. And then you also get a slightly different steering wheel. It's the 3-spoke item from the sport car, and that's because we have the boost button. I'll talk about a little bit more when we take this thing out for a spin. But yeah, it all feels really good, really slick, and it doesn't bombard you with the fact that it's an electric vehicle. It actually feels very easy to wrap your head around. You've still got a start button in the same spot. You've still got this drive-by-wire shifter, which is probably one of the best executed in the industry for rotary gear shifts, wireless charging, and just an air and a feeling of quality in here that is fantastic. One of the bugbears of electric vehicles such as the Polestar 2 and the BMW i4 is the fact that the floor is raised quite heavily, and that means that your knees end up coming up a little bit higher and it's not so comfortable in the back. Now, Genesis says that this isn't the case in the GV70 and that the floor is exactly the same height as in the ICE variant. We'll have to get two next to each other and actually compare that though, because this does feel a little bit higher, but I'm not sure if that's just in my brain sort of configuring that to feel that way. There is also 16 millimeters less legroom, though I've still got a reasonable amount of space in the back of this luxury midsize SUV, and the leather back here is very comfortable. Being that luxury specification, I've also got heating for both of the outboard seats, my own climate control zone back here, and a USB charging point. So overall, it's still very full-featured back here. Because it's been electrified, the e-GV70 loses a little bit of luggage space. The number falls from about 540 litres to 500 litres in this vehicle here. Now, that's still a pretty big boot. In fact, it's bigger than the plug-in hybrid BMW X3, and it's really nicely finished. You've got this sort of dull chrome accenting to stop the plastic getting scratched up on the edge of the tailgate, and you've got lovely carpeting there. Of course, there's no spare under the boot floor, but there is space to store the charging cable, and there's also a vehicle to external devices adapter here in the back of the boot, which is a really nice touch. So, we've got a cheeky preview drive of this Genesis Electrified GV70. We haven't spent a huge amount of time and not on the public roads. That'll all be coming in the third quarter of this year when we get to experience this GV70 at its full Australian launch. But we've got a taster, so I can give you a little bit of insight into how this car drives. There's not that many bumps out here, but the surface is designed to be much like the Pacific Highway, which is just outside of Sydney. This driver training centre was initially designed for New South Wales Highway Patrol to sort of learn how to drive on that kind of road. So it is actually a pretty decent indication for the roads that we will have eventually when we get to drive this car out in the real world. So what is it like? Well, if I was to sum it up in very few words, it would be very similar to a GV70, just one that's electrified. And that's a pretty good thing because in combustion engine form, the GV70 is actually a really nice competitor in this mid-size luxury SUV segment. It isn't quite as sporty to drive as a BMW X3, but I think it's better than probably its closest rival, the Lexus NX. Certainly the feeling of specialness inside the cabin and the feeling of well-built interiors is always a nice thing from the Genesis brand itself. It feels really quality in here, and the NVH is even better because this vehicle is electrified. But let's talk about the powertrain, because that is the big news really. We've got a pair of electric motors, equal outputs, making 180 kilowatts each in boost mode and 350 newton meters for a total combined maximum output of 360 kilowatts of power and 700 newton meters of torque. Now that's only accessible in boost mode for about 10 seconds, and in the rest of the drive modes this car essentially ratchets up its power from Eco, where it feels pretty normal, much like a 2.5 litre turbocharged Genesis GV70. Then you step up to Comfort, where it feels very similar to the 279 kilowatt 3.5 litre turbo, and then if we go into Sport right now and press boost, it's pretty ridiculous. Like, it's really quick, and it comes on in a different way to some other electric cars out there. It's not all about head smashing into the back of the headrest. It's definitely got a little bit of extra smoothness. Now some of that's going to be down to the fact that this car does weigh a fair bit. So 2.3 tons is the number I've been given today. That's about 280 kilograms heavier than an equivalent 3.5 litre turbo all-wheel drive Genesis GV70. So it is a pretty chunky beast, and you do feel that in the corners. This testing twisty country road that we're driving on right now definitely brings out this car's sort of it's an interesting roll characteristic. It doesn't pitch onto the front end as much as the regular GV70. It feels like it rolls all together a little bit more, and maybe the moment of inertia is a little bit different. So it is definitely a different driving experience in the corners. This pre-production vehicle, and I will emphasize that it is a pre-production vehicle, it's not the final specification for this electrified GV70, but it does feel like there's just a little bit of front end push mid-corner in this thing. That can be dialed out in tighter corners by adjusting the drive mode as well. I should add that there are adaptive dampers fitted to this vehicle. It's effectively the luxury specification of GV70 in the combustion engine lineup. So you can't get a sport version, you can't get the bigger 21-inch alloy wheels and the sportier seats and that sort of thing, but I think that kind of suits this car's vibe quite well. But yeah, as I was mentioning before, the drive mode really influences how this car comes out of a corner. In Eco and Comfort, much like the power delivery, it feels pretty normal, like a slightly front biased, slightly understeery all-wheel drive vehicle. But now we've got it dialed into Sport, we're going to come out of this hairpin, and this thing really sort of gives you a little bit of extra overdrive on the rear axle to a point where you almost get a tiny bit of power on oversteer, and that's really cool. So I guess without getting too ridiculous and driving for too long, trying to say too much about this vehicle, because I can't really comment on its ride, because as I said, this road is pretty smooth. It does feel good, feels nice, feels well insulated, a little bit better than the Sport model on 21-inch alloy wheels, I reckon, though we'll have to quantify that in the real world very soon. What I can say is that I reckon this car is going to be pretty cool when it arrives, and I don't know, maybe with its all-wheel drive powertrain and plenty of grunt, the BMW iX3 is going to have a real fight on its hands, especially considering this car is very likely going to be the same price or slightly less, and it comes with a whole bunch more features. And yeah, initial driving suggests it's not bad. Final tuning of the suspension is still to be done. It hasn't been specifically tuned for Australia. It's only been evaluated in terms of the global tune, so they've made a couple of tweaks essentially. Nothing set in stone just just yet, but the guys here have told me that they've been tirelessly working on this around the roads of Sydney, so it should be as close to perfection for our market as you could expect. So yeah, that's a little preview drive of the electrified Genesis GV70. Let me know your thoughts down below. There's a preview of the electrified GV70 before it hits the roads here in Australia, finally in the third quarter of this year. But what do we think? Well, I think the signs are very promising. That powertrain is good, and with a little further finessing to the final interior plastics, fit and finish and that sort of thing, and the driving dynamics, I think the BMW iX3, Mercedes EQC and Audi e-tron are going to have a serious fight on their hands from this vehicle, because it is absolutely loaded with specification and it's pretty quick in this single high-spec luxury variant. But of course, we'll have to see how it performs later in the year. But for now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the electrified GV70. Do you like the fact that it looks just like a normal GV70 rather than a fully fledged electric vehicle, but you have that zero emissions motoring? Let me know down below. And while you're down there leaving your opinion, I'd also love it if you could hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. And as always, thank you very much for watching Chasing Cars.